Tonight, it is my honor to introduce a leading authority in the field, Professor Annick De Houwer. She's the director of the Harmonious Bilingualism Network and president of the International Association for the Study of Child Language. Annick's contribution have truly been transformative. Her work spans from exploring bilingual and monolingual children's language development, touching both linguistic and socio-psychological aspects. She has an impressive array of publications, including the authorship of 4 influential books in the field, and her insights have consistently advanced our understanding of bilingual development. This evening, Professor De Houwer will take us through the topic of harmonious bilingualism for young children and their families. Dear Annick, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. And to all attendees, thank you for joining us. After Professor De Houwer's talk, we will be available for questions and further discussions. Annick, the floor is yours.
Hey, many thanks, Roberto, for this very gracious invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and I feel very honored to speak for so many colleagues and people from all over. Thank you very much. So currently, there are really 2 quite opposite views of bilingualism in general, and child bilingualism also in particular. You've got this one view, which is drawing people towards it. So because there's this positive news about cognitive and neurological benefits. Quite recently on the BBC, actually, some people from UCL were featured in that feature on BBC News. I think it wasn't on the news itself, but on the BBC channel, right? And on the other hand, you have all these ideas that are pulling people away from bilingualism because there are still, and there continue to be, deeply ingrained negative attitudes. Oops, I'm so sorry, I made a mistake there with attitudes. I just noticed it. I'm so sorry. I apologize. Anyway, still, I'm trying to say, because I started studying bilingualism a long time ago, more than 4 decades ago, and there were very many strongly negative attitudes then, and unfortunately, they continue to be there. So in today's increasingly globalized, diversified world, you have this increasing number of young families who find themselves in a bilingual setting. Now, you know, parents may not have much experience with early bilingualism. They may have questions, concerns about how their children will be able to deal with the bilingual setting. But in any case, parents will want overall well-being for their children and their families. We can really start from that assumption, I'm sure. And now, okay. So harmonious bilingualism is presumably what parents want and what families want. And what is it? Well, it refers to a sense of subjective well-being and satisfaction that's experienced by families in a language contact situation. I first started writing about that in 2006 because I was feeling that, you know, there wasn't much attention to the fact that, in fact, there can be negative experiences also attributed to the linguistically diverse situation, and that, you know, it's really important to find out what the factors are that contribute to harmonious bilingualism or the lack of it. Yeah, exactly. So early bilingualism can, unfortunately, be a negative or less than positive experience for children and their families. And I'm going to give you just a few examples which are showing a lack of harmonious bilingualism. They're all based on real people and real examples. I have not made any of this up except the details of particular languages or particular names. So let's look at this couple where the gentleman comes from Italy, Roberto. No, he's not Roberto. He's not Roberto, sorry. But anyway, so he fell in love with this lady from Austria who speaks German and who also speaks excellent Italian. And they speak Italian together. And then they got twins. And, well, the father doesn't understand German. The mother, she thought it was really confusing, would be really confusing for young children to learn 2 languages. And she thought, well, you know, in a few years when they're older, I'll start to speak German to them. Their twins speak only Italian, yeah. And when they got a little older, try as she might, the lady, they wouldn't accept, the kids wouldn't accept her speaking German. They started to cry, in fact, okay? There's another example from Leah, who lives in Bruges, or used to anyway, when I met her. And she had bilingual input from birth, unlike the Italian twins. And she was raised with English and Dutch in the home, but heard very little English. At age 3, she spoke fluent Dutch, and she understood some English, but she said only yes and no. And this greatly angered her English-speaking father, who claimed that his daughter at age 3 was rejecting him. And actually, when I dared mention, but at the time I was just a doctoral student, I dared mention to him that perhaps it was because, you know, he really couldn't spend that much time with her. He told me that does not matter. And he actually cited Chomsky to me, saying that Chomsky had said, input doesn't matter. Now, I'm very sure that Dr. Chomsky has not said that, but he has, of course, not given a lot of attention to the role of input in child language acquisition. Anyhow, here's another example. Now in the city of Oxford, actually, in the child clinic, where another bilingual child, a child who's heard 2 languages from birth, in this case, German and English. Well, the father is very worried because at age 2, the child is still not talking. Seriously, not talking. We do expect children at age 2 to talk, okay? Not in full sentences, but in very short sentences, and to have at least 50 words at minimum, really. So if they're not doing that, alert, red lights. Anyway, the pediatrician just says, stop talking German to him and he'll be fine. Okay. Why is it going that way? I didn't want that. I wanted to go the next way. Yes, because a year later, when the child is 3 years of age, there is the father again at the pediatrician's office saying, well, he's still not talking. So that's after scratching German and no longer speaking German to the child. And he's impossible. Well, oops, then the pediatrician has to admit the child has a major hearing problem, does not have access to hearing. So in the meantime, this child had kind of lost language input and the opportunity to learn for, well, at least 2 years, likely, yes. So it's this idea that there is this little head and there's no space for more than one language. Another example comes from Tuan, who grew up bilingually with Vietnamese and Danish in Denmark. At age 2, he spoke and understood Vietnamese and Danish, and he understood it, well, and he spoke it at a level that you would expect for age 2. He was saying teeny little sentences, both in Vietnamese and in Danish. His parents sent him to a Danish-speaking preschool. They didn't have many other options in Denmark. And the preschool teacher, unfortunately, regarded bilingual input as child abuse and told Tuan's mother to stop speaking Vietnamese at home, or she would report the family to child services. please, you know, this is true. This is not something I am making up. I, in fact, also recently, you know, heard about several similar situations in Norway, and this happens also in the United States. There are unfortunately reports of things like that happening. So Tuan's mother stopped speaking Vietnamese to the child because, of course, she didn't want any problems with child services and have her child be taken away from her. And of course, all of this caused great upset for the whole family, and ultimately made it impossible for Tuan to communicate with his Vietnamese family. Often teachers or doctors advise parents to stop speaking the language that is not a school language. Now, this does not help in learning the school language. You can compare it to, well, maybe practicing two different musical instruments. Like you can be playing the piano or you can be playing the violin. If you stop playing the violin, this is not going to automatically improve your piano practice, right? You can improve your piano playing by playing more piano, okay? Or you can also have, compare this to having two sports, tennis and badminton. It's not because you give up tennis that your badminton will improve. It's the same with language use, because language is a skill. What's also important is that it is really morally unacceptable. Just imagine, there are many parents amongst you, I'm sure, that somebody would come and tell you to stop speaking your language to your child. Anyway, what's important also, it goes against the United Nations Convention for Child Rights, which has been ratified by most countries in the early 1990s. And in particular, Article 29 in Division 1 says that the states parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to, and I'm just, it's my emphasis there on language, the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living also, of course, and for the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. But of course, what I'm talking about today is this language aspect. So when parents have little or no experience with early bilingualism, they make decisions early on whose potentially negative repercussions they do not realize until it is possibly too late, like with the German-Italian couple. Or they may have unrealistic expectations about their children's language development and feel let down by their children if their expectations are not met, like with Leah's father. And they may not at all be prepared for negative attitudes from professionals dealing with children that may have devastating effects on their children and family. Now, having realistic expectations based on solid research will help parents to manage the bilingual setting. Now, and many parents are caught unawares by some aspects of their children's bilingual development, and it will help to become aware of the different ways in which children can become bilingual. And it will also help to know what aspects parents can, in principle, control. So I'll dive into that. Okay, so I'm going to discuss now, just briefly, the main 4 bilingual language learning environments for children under age 12. And it starts with bilingual first language acquisition, or BFLA, which means a child has 2 first languages, 2 L1s, heard at home from birth. And I'm talking here basically about the later school language and another language. Of course, it's also possible that it's just two languages that are not the later school language. That's also possible. And that would also be BFLA. And I don't know why it's always doing that. Okay. And then there is early second language acquisition. ESLA. That means the child starts out with one language at home from birth, and it's a language that is not the later school language. And then before age 6, children start to be immersed in a second language through daycare or preschool, and that's the L2. So they have a clear L2, whereas the BFLA children do not have an L2. So that the L2 in ESLA children is the school language. Then there is also second language acquisition. So for children under age 12 and older as well, they have, like the ESLA children, they have one language at home from birth. That's not the later school language. And after age 6, children start to be immersed in a second language, again, the L2, the school language, through school, yeah. And what's different from the ESLA children is that immediately what these children, these second language acquisition children who have not had any input to the L2 until age 6 or 7 or 8, as the case might be, they are expected to learn to read and write in it. And that's, so this literacy aspect is quite different from ESLA. And of course, in the meantime, these children are also older. They're cognitively more mature than the ESLA children, and they have also much more experience with their first language than the ESLA children. And then also we have foreign language acquisition, FLA. So either already at preschool, any BFLA or ESLA child may start to have classes in a foreign language. And a foreign language is a language that children do not need or hear outside the preschool. And of course, if they're older at primary school, then any BFLA, ESLA, or SLA child may start to have classes in a foreign language, but I will not discuss this case now anymore. So the estimate is, in terms of BFLA and ESLA and SLA, estimate is that in Western countries, BFLA occurs 3 times more frequently than the combination ESLA or SLA. So it really appears to be far more common for children to hear the school language and another language X at home rather than just another language X. And the evidence for that comes from 2 large surveys of home language use. I don't understand why it keeps jumping here. Anyway, so here, that's the evidence. So there's a sample from Belgium and one from the United States. There are families where parents only speak the LX language at home, and we don't have enough information from those surveys whether we're dealing with ESLA or SLA, but in any case, it's not BFLA, definitely not. And it's quite amazing that in both these studies, the percentages are virtually identical, so 24 and 25% of the families are that, actually. And yeah, I just want to, the Belgian data are my own, where I only looked here at dual parent families, and the US data are from Adam Winsler and colleagues from a big sample in Florida. And we have no information there on parent status. But anyway, we have the BFLA families mean at home, parents speak the LX and the school language. So both languages are present in the home. We have there remarkably similar numbers there, 76%, 75%. Now, this fact that it's far more common for children to hear the school language and another language X at home rather than just another language X is often totally ignored by educators and researchers alike. They often ignore the possibility that children hear 2 languages at home. And this can have effects. People should actually realize that there are a lot of BFLA children. Now, what's very important to realize is that the different bilingual language learning environments for children lead to basically different language learning and language use trajectories in children. and also to a different personal experience with bilingualism and both languages for children and their families alike. So if we compare BFLA to ESLA and SLA, families have very different connections and expectations. So most BFLA families have emotional, cultural, family connections with both languages, and they want their children to speak both at home. Now, for most ESLA or SLA families, there is a strong emotional, cultural, and family connection with just a single language, okay? And there's little engagement at home with the L2 or the school language, so often that's the majority language also, and there's no expectation that children speak the L2 at home, but just the LX. Now, let's see what the outcomes are for families' expectations, and they are very different. So in BFLA, data from, in fact, the survey that I did, in 70% of BFLA families, children speak both languages, 70%, which means that in 30% of BFLA families, children speak just a single language. For ESLA or SLA, we find that in just 3% of those families, children do not speak the L1. And in 97% of them, children do speak the L1. So I'm just talking here about speaking or not speaking, not about how well children speak these languages. So for BFLA, what the evidence finds is, well, it goes against expectations for nearly 1/3 of families. Whereas in ESLA, well, the expectations there fit the expectations for most families. Why is that? Well, also in a much cited article, I looked at the role of parental home language choice patterns, and these can explain a lot. We find for the families in the survey where there were just 2 languages involved, namely the school language Dutch and another language X, we find that there are 5 possible, logically possible patterns for both in dual parent families. Namely, you could be, both parents could be speaking just the X language. I didn't want to show this yet. What's going on? Anyway, never mind. I'm sorry. Whoops. Okay, didn't want that yet. I just want to go through the patterns. So both parents speak just the X language, or in the next possibility, both parents speak the X language and one parent in addition speaks the school language. Then we have the pattern where both parents speak both the X language and the school language. Then we have the pattern that's supposedly one person, one language, where one parent speaks just X, the other parent speaks just the school language. And this is home language use. And we don't know who's speaking what to whom, that we don't know, but it's just what languages are spoken in the home. And then at the bottom, we find the pattern where both parents speak the school language at home, and in addition, one parent the X language. Now let's see, we can look here at the degree of success for the X language. So what's marked green is 97% and 93%, and there's no statistically significant difference between those two. I want to make that quite clear. Anyway, so the top pattern where both parents speak the X language, those are ESLA or SLA families. So there we have, it's, yeah, I have a good chance of having children who actually speak the X language. And then we have BFLA families, so where both parents speak the X language and one parent speaks the school language, and their chances are pretty good for the X language. But then we've got a big drop, namely, then we get to 78% and 73% for two other types of BFLA families, those where both languages are spoken by both parents, and those with a supposed one person, one language pattern. And again, I should say there's no difference statistically between the 78% and 73% families. At the very bottom, so the pattern that leads to the least success for the X language, that's the pattern where BFLA families, where both parents speak the school language at home and one parent the X language. Then the chances drop to 34% only. Now, in fact, when you look at other surveys from across the globe, just in terms of do children who are raised bilingually, do they actually speak the X language, the language that is not the school language? Well, we find that as many as a quarter to a fifth, that's a lot, of children who grow up with multiple languages speak only a single language. And that is always the school language, the single language eventually, you know, when we look at kids at primary school age. So this runs counter that they always speak the school language. It runs counter to the popular idea that's often espoused in Western media that bilingual children do not learn the school language. Yes, they do. They do. But what happens if children speak only a single language, in spite of parents speaking to them in another one? It may be impossible for children to communicate with members of their extended family or family friends. Communication between parents and children may be negatively affected. And both parents and children may feel a sense of loss of identity, culture, emotional bonding. And when they become young adults, children may be very angry with their parents for not making sure children grew up speaking the parental language. And Janice Nakamura has called this aptly language regret. Now, all these things detract from people's subjective well-being and are in the way of harmonious bilingualism. Now, luckily, the research shows that many children around the world are quite able to speak two languages fluently from early on. And we also know from more and more research that has looked at it that well-developed proficiency in two languages strengthens and supports the well-being and integration of children who are growing up bilingually. In addition, for ESLA and SLA children, higher levels of proficiency in emergent bilingual children's L1 support their developing proficiency in the L2. And I'm now going to quickly run through some typical global developmental trajectories for comprehension in BFLA and ESLA before age 6. Now, comprehension is very often the only measure actually that is used to assess proficiency in young bilingual children and even also in primary school. Comprehension is, of course, very important. In BFLA, children learn to understand two languages at the same time. This is totally different from ESLA, where children they're actually quite monolingual at the very beginning, right? They're first learning to understand only one language. Now, for the non-school language in BFLA, well, children understand quite a lot of that by age 1. So when they're just starting to walk, and there's an ever-increasing knowledge, so they continue to learn more and more. That's the same for the ESLA children, the non-school language by age 1, ever-increasing knowledge. Now let's look at the school language, which is also an L1 for the BFLA children. Well, they also understand a lot in the school language by age 1 with an ever-increasing knowledge in it. Now, that's very different for the ESLA children. They will start to understand the school language, the L2, much later. And I've said here, in function of age of first regular exposure, age is important, but of course there's also other aspects that are important, yeah? But I won't have time to go into that. But once they start to understand some of this L2, their knowledge increases eventually. Then comes typical global development for production before age 6 in BFLA and in ESLA. So BFLA children are able to produce words and often also very short sentences in both the school language and the non-school language by age 2. Yeah. Now, for ESLA, they speak the non-school language, the L1, by age 2, and they have also an increasing proficiency in the L1, although we know that there is attrition and loss possible in some children. Now, for BFLA, back to BFLA, I'm making a distinction here between BFLA 1 and BFLA 2. For BFLA 1, that's about 3/4 of children. They have an increasing proficiency in speaking both languages after age 2. For about 1/4 of children, in the case of BFLA 2, there is increasing proficiency only in the school language after age 3 to 4. So that starts to become noticeable then. And so there definitely is a lot of chance of attrition or even loss of the non-school language in production. For ESLA children, their production of their second language, the school language, will be much later, so not age 2 like for the BFLA children, because again, it depends on when did they start to hear the school language and, you know, when did they start to actually try to talk in it, yes? But once they start to try talking in the L2, there is increasing proficiency in it. Okay, so this is all extremely global and extremely fast, but that's all we can have time for today. Now I want to focus on typical global developments for SLA children between ages 6 and 12, because remember, they're not SLA children until, you know, not before age 6 by definition. Oh, what's going on? Okay, here we go. For comprehension, they first start to learn to understand one language. By definition, they're monolingual first. So they have their language 1 by age 1, ever increasing L1 understanding, which is very well developed by age 6. And this is different from an ESLA child who may have started learning a second language or hearing a second language at age 3. Well, that child has only had 3 years to develop that L1. And language 2 is much later, so after age 6. And it will develop in function of age of first regular exposure and other factors as well. And there's an ever increasing L2 understanding. What about production? Again, production in the L1 is like any monolingual child, language 1 by age 2, ever increasing L1 speaking proficiency, which is well developed by age 6. Language 2 comes much later, again, also in function of age of first regular exposure and other factors, and that will be an ever increasing speaking proficiency in the L2. Now, finally, let's compare all these children, BFLA children, ESLA, and SLA children, once they've reached primary school age. So what little evidence there is, because really, I looked very hard when I was preparing my latest book on bilingual development in childhood, which came out in 21, but was very difficult to find the evidence for this table. And so things may change. You know, we may get more evidence and it may be able to get very different. Who knows? Anyway, we have to make a distinction between the non-school language and the school language. And then I make for the non-school language a distinction here between comprehension and production. And so for BFLA children who are now in primary school, many understand their non-school language fine and also speak it fine, but many have problems. Many understand it perhaps less well, and many children do not speak it at all, okay? That's for the non-school language. If we go to ESLA, the comprehension in the non-school language is likely fine, but we really don't know all that much about it. And the production is mostly fine, but there's very little evidence, and some less so. For SLA, they're like just monolingual children. Everything is just hunky-dory, right? In their non-school language when they're in primary school. Now let's look at the school language. For comprehension and production, I'm not going to make a distinction here now. For the school language, in all BFLA children, the school language is mostly fine. Their proficiency is increasing. ESLA children, well, they're getting there, yeah, but it's always increasing, but they're getting there. SLA children, they're just starting with the school language in primary school, but they very rapidly improve. And in fact, they have a much better start than the ESLA children. So they pick up this new language basically faster than the ESLA children at a younger age. The SLA children are cognitively more mature once they start learning the second language and have more experience with the non-school language. Okay. Now, there are also, well, more similarities between the three cases. All bilingual children may use utterances combining words from two languages, which I've always called mixed utterances. Bilingual children who speak two languages are able to fluently switch from one to the other. I've not heard any reports of children having really problems with that. Attrition or loss of a language is possible for any bilingual child. And with regular exposure to the school language, all typically developing bilingual children eventually end up speaking it, but at variable levels of proficiency. Uneven development across languages is normal. So languages develop at a different pace, and children are able to talk about some things in one language, but not in the other. So that depends a lot on lexicon used in one particular language and not in the other. Still, there is a great heterogeneity amongst bilingual children in the first decade of life, depending on when and where they started regularly hearing their languages for day-to-day use. Sorry about that. So it's really important to recognize this heterogeneity, both in clinical and in educational practice and in research. And often, unfortunately, that's not done. Especially this fundamental difference between BFLA and ESLA in infancy and in early childhood needs to be taken into account much more than it is really that difference. Back to harmonious bilingualism now. So it arises when children who regularly hear two or more languages, when they speak all of them well. And this contributes to both parents and children's well-being. We know from this research on early bilingual development that for the school language, that all children ultimately develop proficiency in it, that they do so at different rates, depending on when they first started to regularly hear it. It's not the only factor, but it's a very major one. But all bilingual children can develop high levels of proficiency in the school language by the time they're 12 years old. Okay. Now, do parents have a role to play as far as the school language goes? Well, I think, yes, they do. For BFLA children, it will be important to offer children high quality and high frequency input in the school language from the start. And I'll explain a little further on what I mean with high quality and high frequency input. For ESLA and SLA children, it will be important for parents to show positive attitudes towards the school language. Note, as I mentioned before, the families will have different emotional connections with a different language, and the school language is not typically used at home. So it's really important, though, for parents to show positive attitudes. They can also, and they can do this through many means, through which they show their positive attitudes are implied. They can seek out extracurricular activities in the school language for children. If they can afford it, they can hire childminders who speak the school language well and can play with children using it. And parents should definitely refrain from negative comments about the school language. Unfortunately, that does happen, that they are there. If at all possible, parents should learn to speak and read in the school language, but they should not use it with their children except for joint book reading, and perhaps later on help with, if that's possible for the parent, help with homework. We also know from the research on early bilingual development that the non-school language is at risk, especially for BFLA children, but for other bilingual children as well. Now, as parent, you cannot change the negative attitudes of professionals, relatives, and friends towards a particular language or child bilingualism. And I'm sorry, I don't know why that keeps moving where I don't want it. I have no idea. Anyway, there are many things that parents can do to help support the development of the non-school language. First off, parents, both of them, need to have a positive or at least a neutral attitude towards the non-school language and child bilingualism. They should not be afraid of child bilingualism. You know, I really want to emphasize that a bilingual environment presents no threat to children's language development, although some people might actually think so. So from the start, parents should also decide whether it's important for them that their child speaks their language. Now, if so, parents should be aware that raising a child who speaks the non-school language well takes quite a lot of work, in addition to the already heavy load of raising any child. And parents really should be willing and ready to invest in the non-school language. How so? Well, this gets to the quality, high quality, and quantity of input by talking to children a lot in the non-school language, even after a hard day when you're tired. By answering children's questions in the non-school language, by answering children's questions. Full stop is important, but in particular in the non-school language, by explaining a lot to children in the non-school language, by reading books in the non-school language with children every day from 3 months onwards. Yes, you heard me right. Babies at age 3 months, yes, you can already have your little infant on your lap and you can look at together with the baby and try to focus the baby's attention to a little wooden book that is very attractive, and you can just rhyme a little bit, and that's already the reading. But you do this and it's fun, and ultimately your child will ask for you to read. Exposing children to rhymes and songs in the non-school language, all of that is also important. So all of this contributes to high quality and high quantity of the input. And getting help from relatives and friends is also important. Have conversations, have your child have conversations, play games online with grandparents who speak the non-school language, for instance, yes, or other relatives. Now, related to input frequency are these parental language choice patterns. And, you know, I want to remind you of the survey earlier that I discussed earlier. So to support children's speaking of the non-school language, why does it change? It is best if both parents speak the non-school language at home, and at most one parent speaks the school language at home as well. That is the best, but it's not always possible to do that. And also, it's not all. In order for young children to learn to speak the non-school language, they must actually need to speak it. So to support children speaking the non-school language, caregivers and parents must create a necessity for children to respond in the non-school language that parents are speaking to children. This need should be created from the moment children start to produce recognizable words. I realize that is really, you know, people are really waiting for their child's first word. And when they say something that sounds like it could be a word, people are just over the top, as they should be. But in a bilingual setting, the first words maybe, or the words may not be the words in the language that you're speaking to your child. So already at that age, you might want to respond to this and try to give input that supports the non-school language. Yeah. So children are socialized into speaking the expected language right from the start. Now, when your child is 1 year of age, this may not be possible, but by the time they are close to 2, this is definitely possible. So here we get to the importance of parental discourse strategies, and that follows the ideas here of Liz Lanza, who proposed the bilingual family interaction model, BIFIM. Now, this term was created by myself and Janice Nakamura with Liz Lanza's permission. Thank you, Liz. Anyway, so what is BIFIM? BIFIM describes how parents respond to 2-year-old bilingual children's use of a societal language, usually the school language, that the parent is not presently speaking to them. So Lanza showed that parental responses, and that's what discourse strategies are, that's all, how they help explain why 2-year-olds bilingually raised children may speak just a single language. And in a review of 22 observational studies across the globe, there really aren't that many, unfortunately, but where there were micro-level analyses of dyadic parent-child interactions involving children between ages 1 and 12, so offering a developmental perspective, we found that it's really so important to use what Lanza has also called monolingual parental discourse strategies from the very first words onwards. So these strategies support children's use of the non-school language. So within a particular conversation, I will show 2 strategies which are the best that parents can use if children address them in the school language when parents are speaking the non-school language to them. So there is the request for clarification. We all do that, also in a monolingual setting. We ask, what did you just say? We say, what, right? And parents, they should use the non-school language to ask children to clarify their utterance. So they should just say, what? Children usually respond by changing from the school language to the non-school language. Another way is a request for confirmation through a yes/no question. So parents can use a question in the non-school language that translates what they thought children intended to say in the school language. And children usually respond in the non-school language. Well, but they'll say yes or no, right? Usually yes. So it's very simple, but these 2 strategies, responses, they really support, they really socialize children into using the same language that the parent is speaking within a particular conversation. That doesn't mean that a parent should only speak one language with a child, no, but within a conversation, it's important to stick to one language if you find it important that your child speaks the non-school language. If you don't find it important, that's another matter. Now, back to the negative attitudes, and I'm nearly done. Yeah. Back to the negative attitudes from professionals and others that parents may encounter. Although this is really difficult, parents should be willing to engage with those professionals. If they get the advice, stop speaking your language, so advice that discriminates against the use of the non-school language in the home, and parents should ask professionals what the research-based evidence is for their advice. Now, pediatricians typically have no training in early bilingual development. Neither do preschool teachers or school teachers. And parents can also ask, how does your advice relate to the United Nations Convention on Child Rights? Yes. And if parents find this difficult and need support with this, they can contact me. I'll be happy to engage with the professional concerned. Not kidding. And in any case, through HaBilNet, we offer advice, individual advice, to parents, and you can go on our website and request a consultation. Now, there's this really sad note that I sadly have to add, that unfortunately there are some bilingualism researchers who are biased against child bilingualism and whose biased views are picked up by professionals who deal with young children. You could take a look at my 23 article in Applied Psycholinguistics, for an example. So in conclusion, the parental use of monolingual discourse strategies combined with lots of regular and high quality parental input in especially the non-school language and positive parental attitudes towards all children's languages and child bilingualisms, all these together strongly support children's high proficiency in 2 languages and thereby bilingual families' positive experience with harmonious bilingualism. And with this, I thank you so much for being there, for taking the time. And this was the main source for my talk. Thanks very much.